This is Identity at the Center. If it has anything to do with IAM, this is the go-to podcast. Now your hosts, Jim McDonald and Jeff Stedman.
Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. I'm Jeff, and that's Jim. Hey, Jim.
Hey, Jeff. How are you?
Oh, not so bad. Yourself?
Great. Hey, I know we want to cover a lot of topics here today in our preamble, and the show's going to be different. So I don't know if you want to touch on that first and then come back to me with my topic.
with our opening banter. Yeah, sure. So today we're going to replay a roundtable that you and I hosted with the Carolinas Identity Roundtable. It was a discussion we had around role-based access control we did in December. People have not heard it unless you were part of that roundtable live that day. So we're going to kind of treat that as today's episode and kind of have this quick intro and get to it. But what do you have for me here?
So what I have for you is, as I was thinking about RBAC and kind of going into that discussion, was I wanted to talk about AI. And then I thought of a real cool angle that I had to ask you about, which is AI, robots. And let's just take an example, which I don't want to have the argument right now whether Siri, the Apple voice module, is AI or not. But my question to you is, do you need to be polite to AI? Or can you just be gruff and rude and just say, give me this, give me that?
It's an interesting question. And Siri is not AI. That's what I have right now. It's just a voice response system, and not even a very good one. Do you have to be nice to your AI? That's the question.
You have to be polite.
I would say no, but I also get the idea of, please give me blah, blah, blah information, right? You type it in. When I first started using like ChatGPT and things like that, I had more formal sentence structure asking for, here's what I'm looking for, blah, blah, blah. Now I'm treating it, depending on which AI I'm using, whether it's Bing's version, for example, which uses GPT-4, or if I'm using just the ChatGPT normal interface, is I'm treating it almost like a search query instead of fully formed sentences, for example. So it kind of depends when I'm doing it, but I would say for the most part, I am not polite, but I'm also not impolite. It's not like I'm like, hey, go get this, you son of a, whatever it may be. But I'm not doing please and thank yous and things like that.
So I usually do please and thank yous, which I think humanizes it. But in the back of my mind, I'm also like, okay, it's not a human, but it's kind of raised to like, you're not going to get in trouble for saying please and thank you too much. It's better to say it when you don't have to than not say it when you should be saying it. So I actually say, Siri, please give me directions to X, Y, and Z, which may be a little weird, I guess. And I kind of get that, but yeah, it's just what I do. Now, have you seen, I got you into watching Picard, right?
Yeah, I have not seen the last season yet, though.
Okay, I haven't seen the last season yet either. Or I think I saw like the first episode of the last season. Anyway, there was an episode where it was all the humanoid AIs, which I don't really remember what the right term for it was. But basically, all the people were being real rude and treating the people like Data like they were just like secondhand garbage, right? Mm-hmm. And then they got sick of it and came back and attacked the humans. And maybe that's the future we're heading for, is that they'll get sick of being mistreated, the AIs, and I don't know.
Well, I think at some point it'll have like, once there's a physical manifestation in the real world, that might be the changer. Right? I
when they look like people.
Yeah. Doesn't necessarily, I think, have to look like a person, but some sort of like, people have like these little cute little robot dog things, right? And some people are pleasant to the Roombas in the room and things like that, right? Stuff like that. Some people aren't. I think once there's that physical sort of connection there, like that's maybe where things might change. But right now, most AI is just a text prompt in a web browser or on your screen. It's kind of difficult to contextualize that as, a human kind of concept or a human sort of interaction when you're so used to just typing it into Google. Do you type, please and thank you into Google?
No, I don't.
I don't either.
Yeah. No, and I think that's it. That's probably a good differentiation. I was kind of watching a video of the keynote from the CEO over at RSA. It was at the RSA conference, which was last week. And he was talking about AI and identity and kind of like this, I don't know what to call it, a collision course that we're on, but how AI could actually make identity work better. And in his presentation, he had kind of what was like a human form, started out as like a robot that turned into a human overlay. It looked like a real human was speaking to the camera, but it was an AI who was answering his questions. And I thought that was, I don't know how far down the road that is. In some areas, it's interesting. In some like IAM tools, what they call AI, I think it's a farce, right? It's like, no, that's just like, advanced predictive capabilities of your system, but it's a far cry from like what everybody's worried about. Like AI is going to make humans obsolete.
Yeah. That video you mentioned for RSA, I thought was good. You sent it to me and I watched it. I thought it was an interesting tech demo. I don't know how much of it was live. If I had to guess, it was probably scripted. And I was kind of looking for like, okay, when are they hitting play and pause on this video with these
for sure
pre-canned responses and things like that. But the technology exists. There's a company out there, I think it's called DID or D-ID, that does like these virtual avatar things, and you can make them say, basically whatever you want. You give it a typed out script and it kind of figures it out. It's interesting because I think it adds that visual, maybe it's not a physical, but it's something on your screen. You say, okay, well, here is, in quote unquote, a person who is talking to me. So if you think about like today, a chat bot from the identity perspective, in the bottom right of your web browser is probably this little thing that flies out. It's like, oh, ask me anything. And then it's 50-50 on whether or not I can actually answer your question, right? Or actually help you. But it's not really AI. It's basically just looking for, keywords and phrases that map back somewhere to some sort of script that's associated with, oh, you asked about billing. Here are a bunch of links about billing, right? It's all that kind of stuff. But I think at some point, AI is going to get more, democratized or more prevalent within stuff like this. You and I were actually kind of talking about this yesterday when we were talking about kind of AI, especially in identity products. I think there is a big difference today between what we call AI in, May of 2023 versus May of 2021. I think there's been a big shift, with these large language models coming out that really expands on what does it actually mean to be AI. I think in the good old days, let's call it like 2021 and before, AI meant really just some sort of advanced pattern matching or, things like that. I don't think that's AI anymore. I think that's kind of weak sauce if that's what you're calling AI. When I think of AI and identity, I think of, this is the use case I kind of mentioned to you yesterday. I was kind of thought that might be interesting is I go into my IGA product and I say, oh, I'm conducting an access review. And what do most people who do access reviews struggle with? Who is the person and what the heck does this access even mean or let me do? If there was a assistant that I could call up and say, hey, who is this person? Tell me more about them. And what can this access do in terms that are easy to understand and sort of interface with? That would be an interesting application because that solves, I think, one of the biggest real world pain points of conducting an access review is the people who are supposed to do the review don't know what they're doing. And it's not necessarily their fault or their problem. They've just been, say, Jim, you own the blah, blah, blah marketing group, and you're going to review it every quarter or month or year. And, good luck figuring out if that is still correct. And, here is 100 people have access to it that may or may not, be part of your department. I think that would solve a big problem.
I kind of wonder what the approach is going to be, because I think one of the things that you pointed out was that some of these AI systems like create that human interface. So now you're looking at somebody, looks like you're talking to a person, you present them with a question. Now somewhere in the background, they're scouring the data to come back with an answer. So maybe there's one technology that provides the human interface, another technology like ChatGPT that does this language model. But I think, on top of that, overlay kind of the question that you wanted to ask was really like an advanced identity management question, which was, kind of comparing who has access to what are they actually using it for? In other words, what is the access that they have that they shouldn't have? And modern IGA systems can't answer that question. I think that's the next revolution. And I think that's how we get to zero trust, right? It's so funny. Like, there's so many, not just zero trust, but least privilege. There's so many CISOs who I've talked to over the years who say we follow a least privilege model. In other words, their policy is least privilege. But then we start talking about role-based access control, which, my feeling is that role-based access control it's not least privilege, right? It works against least privilege. And role mining takes it even further. This starts saying that 85% of the people have this access, so why not just give it to 100%? It's only 15% more. That's the exact opposite of least privilege, right?
Yep.
But ultimately, what's interesting though is like this is a problem that I think is so hard to solve in the enterprise for existing infrastructure. So, company controlled infrastructure. But it seems like CIEM, KEEM, whatever you want to, cloud entitlement, identity
Cloud
management.
infrastructure and
cloud infrastructure
I
entitlement management. Yeah, thanks. But it seems like we're getting closer to solving it there, right? And maybe it's because the platforms make the information available, and now you can say, okay, these are over provisioned accounts versus these accounts over here are, properly provisioned. To me, it's like that's what we need to be able to do for applications. That's what we need to be able to do for Active Directory groups and things like that. But the technology, as far as I can tell, is not out there today.
Yeah. Well, collecting the data is one thing. Understanding the data and the context in which it's presented is a completely different thing. I hope we're getting closer to that, but it's going to be a layered approach. You'll have, different sorts of interfaces, different types of things. And maybe at some point, someone will come out with, I don't know, IGA 3.0, whatever that looks like. And then maybe it is something that's more modern. It's more, really leveraging true AI, not what we've been calling AI for the last decade or so. But
yeah. And so I think you made a great point there, right? It's like gathering the data, making sense of the data, two different things that we're not good at right now. And I think it's making sense of the data is where the AI really steps in, because it's like now you're looking at a problem that the human mind cannot crunch. RBAC was designed around, let's make this so people can understand it. I think the next level is like, people don't have to calculate the data or understand all the roles. You can find out, like, you gave this access, this is what access is being used, and automatically take away the access they're not using.
Yeah. Hey, Jim, you're doing this access review. Here's this person. The last time they used this access was 6 months ago, and here's why they used it. We think you should get rid of it, but you've got the
company
final
policies
decision
to take it away. Do you want to override that?
Yeah. I mean, there we go. We just solved it. IGA 3.0 coming to a product near you, I'm sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we probably want to get to the interview or the roundtable discussion we had, but it would be unfair for me to note that Backed by Popular Demand is our IDAC jingle. Tried something for 10 episodes. I like the voice, so I'm going to use the voice, but we went back to our guitar jingle. So if you were a fan of that, and my terrible musicianship of putting that together, enjoy until I decide to change it again.
I mean, a lot of people have come up to me and said, "Miss the guitar jingle." And
I had no idea that people were that interested in it.
I liked it. I mean, I told you I liked it, but I'll also be honest. I can't listen to a lot of our own episodes because I, like most people.
Why do you need to?
Exactly. You have to listen because you edit, but
yeah,
I can avoid listening to myself. Mm-hmm. The other thing that I wanted to say is just, and this isn't me trolling for more 5-star reviews and comments on Apple Podcasts, even though I'd love to have those. Troll away. But I did want to say, like, I was reading through some of them over the last few days, and it's like, there's one by MB Hedgehog, which I know you shared this on Twitter at one point, mm-hmm. but it's like, it's such a great review. And I think it like helps other people, find the podcast, right? The more reviews we get, the more it shows up in search results. So that's one good thing. But also, I just want people to know that when those comments are made, they get read by you and I, and they are appreciated.
Yeah, it's very cool to get some sort of acknowledgement. Usually it's just you and I sitting here on an afternoon or an evening staring at each other, recording and, figuring things out. And, usually we've got a guest at this point, but today it's just the two of us. But yeah, it's very cool when people take the time out to do that. And that's really the best way. And as of now, the only way you can really help us is, like, subscribe, rate, review, all that good stuff. That means a lot to us and, certainly helps us, get more traction in the space. Let's see. The last thing we've got before we get to the RBAC discussion is Identiverse coming up. It's only 3 weeks away, Jim. So in 3 weeks, you and I will be at Identiverse. Identiverse 2023. It's heading to Las Vegas. We're going to be there. Join the digital identity community at the Aria Resort and Casino in Las Vegas, May 30th to June 2nd. It's a must-attend event that brings together over 2,500 security professionals for 4 days of world-class learning, engagement, and entertainment. And as a Identity at the Center listener, you can get 20% off of your registration. You only got a couple weeks left, so you got to get on that horse. You can use code IDV23-ICEN20. Just rolls right off the tongue at Identiverse.com. We'll have a link in our show notes. Make it easy. You click the link, it automatically puts the code in. And, that helps us as well, right? More people who use our code kind of shows that, hey, it's worth it, to get the podcast out to, some of these events and maybe do some partnerships like we're doing here with Identiverse. So,
yeah. And not to mention, also on Tuesday night during the opening reception, we'll be set up in a mini stage outside of the expo hall, which is where the opening reception will be held.
I don't know if it'll be a stage, probably just a table, but we'll have a spot. We will be recording just outside.
I use the term stage very loosely.
All the world's a stage. We'll just treat the Shakespeare definition.
Yeah, but it's not going to just be us in the corner. So hopefully a lot of you can hang out, listen to us record live. We're going to have a few drop-in guests, and really looking forward to that.
Yeah, 7 p.m. Tuesday night, local time, Las Vegas. We'll be kicking things off there and getting things going, and hopefully see a lot of friendly faces and new and familiar faces as well. We're always looking to meet with folks and stuff like that. So
I'll have stickers too.
Oh, you'll have stickers. Good. Okay, I'm out. So I've got no stickers left.
I've got over 100.
Over 100. Okay. All right. Should we get to the Carolinas Identity Roundtable?
Let's do that.
Okay. So this is something that we did, Jim and I, December of 2022. So just about 5 months ago as of today. Definitely want to thank Tom Lennon from SailPoint. He's the one who invited us. As a new member of the Carolinas, it was cool to kind of land with sort of my feet on the ground and meet up with some like-minded people in the identity space. So just to kind of preface the discussion, it was around role-based access control, and it was Jim and I kind of hosting this conversation with a couple other people. So we had Beth Goins. She's an information security IAM and governance manager at Arvis Bank. We also had Prince Jones, who is a senior manager at Train Technologies, and then Ashley Rouse, who is a lead information security analyst at Lowe's. And they were kind enough to set aside, some time with us in the group to kind of talk about their experiences from a role-based access control perspective in the real world. So this isn't theoretical. These are people who are doing it in the real world, and not only doing it, but doing it really well. I was kind of impressed with how far along they were in each of their journeys and how they were able to, make decisions and make their programs a success on at least on the role-based side of things. So hopefully people will enjoy that. And I'll have links in our show notes, or if people want to connect with them directly and ask them questions, as well as to the Carolina Identity Roundtable as well on LinkedIn, which is a LinkedIn group that Jim and I are a part of. So with that, I'll go ahead and roll the tape, and we'll talk with everyone in the next one. Thank you so much for the invite. Thanks, Tom. Thanks for not only inviting us to this, but also just the group in general. I'm a recent transplant down to the Carolinas. I come from Chicago for 40 years. And 5 months ago, I made the trek down to the mountains of Western North Carolina in the Asheville area. So I've got Cedar Mountain kind of out my window right here. And I'm happy to join like-minded identity people. I'm joined by my friend Jim McDonald. He and I do a podcast, like Tom mentions, called Identity at the Center. It is nothing to do with our day jobs, which is identity and access management consulting for a company called RSM, but we're not going to do a commercial for them or anything really. But it is just something we've been doing for the last 3 years on the side. It's sort of like our night job, our night gig that we do. And we've had a lot of great conversations over the years with folks all across the identity space, listeners, send their topics in and stuff like that. So we try to keep it like a vendor neutral, safe place. We don't want it to turn into like a boring, like corporate podcast. So that's why, we own it off to the side and we don't let the companies that we work for have too much say in what we do. So that's pretty much how we run it. And, hopefully people will check it out. The idea for today's conversation is basically take that spin of what we do on the podcasts and sort of bring it to the conversation here. And we're going to talk about role-based access control. And whenever we have topics like this that are so meaty and juicy, we like to have different guests on with us to kind of lend their expertise. So I'm going to go around the room and give people a chance to introduce themselves. First, we've got Beth Goins. She's the Information Security IAM and Governance Manager for Arvis Bank. Welcome, Beth.
Thank you very much. Hi, everybody. I have 20 plus years of experience in application development and product implementation, and 6 years in the information security and governance space. My main focus for identity management is ensuring that there's consistent and equitable access for all users while minimizing friction. And working for a financial institution, my current position, top priority is compliance. I first officially got into the identity space when I was hired for a job where I thought I was going to be working on an IBM mainframe, and ended up working in information security and identity on my first day. Well, there was nothing like on-the-job training.
I have nightmares of RACF and administrating those, so
yes.
We should probably share some war stories about that. Thanks for that. Yeah. Next up, we've got Prince Jones. He's a Senior Manager with Train Technologies. Welcome, Prince.
Hello, welcome. I am Prince Jones. I work at Train, and I started and my IT journey over 17 years ago, and I've been doing RBAC type of work and identity work for the last probably 15 years. I started in the Oracle R12, Oracle 11i space. So that's where I got all of my, my juicy experience from. And currently I am responsible for identity at Train, where we're doing IGA, privileged access management, and our Federation SSO solutions under our umbrella. Glad to be here and to talk with you.
Yeah, so just a few things going on. Nothing too heavy, right?
Just a few.
Ashley's next. She's Ashley Rouse. She's the lead information security analyst from Lowe's. Welcome, Ashley.
Thank you. Hey, everybody. So I've been in the IT industry for about 8 years. I started on the consulting side. I'm doing a lot of IT audits and a lot of PCI compliance rocks. And then I actually moved from consulting to the industry where I've been in the IAM space and been focused mainly on RBAC for the past 3.5 years.
So you kind of went the opposite path that myself and Jim. You started off in the dark side, and then
I did.
Light. Jim and I started off on the light side, and we moved to the dark side of consulting a while back. So I guess congratulations on getting out. Jim,
thank you.
You're next. Jim McDonald, go for it.
Hey, Jeff. First, I want to thank you for introducing me as your friend. I mean, 7 years of working together with somebody, it's not always easy to stay friends, but you and I, we do the podcast. We work great together, and really looking forward to, talking with the group here today. We picked this topic of RBAC because I don't think that, we step into it as like the authoritative voice. I think everybody's got experience with RBAC that can come to the table. I'm sure everybody who's listening in, plus this panel of great IAM professionals, we've all got our experience with what works and what doesn't work. And so I think it's a great topic from that perspective. It's something that we've all got a perspective on.
Yeah, it's a difficult nut to crack. I think a lot of people get intimidated when they start hearing about role-based access control and sort of the horror stories that come along with it. Hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands roles, right? How is this thing going to work? I think before we get too far along, though, we probably want to define what it is that RBAC is, because I think there are lots of terminology that we use in the identity space where, we might call it one thing. Maybe it's called entitlements in another system, or maybe it's roles, or maybe it is groups, right? There's a lot of different ways to do it. And I think what I'll do is I'll start off with Prince. How do you define role-based access control? Like, what does that mean to you and your organization?
Yeah, so I'll explain it how I explain to kind of a leader, right, without the technicals. And I basically just describe it as this mechanism for how we grant or restrict access to people. And we typically do it according to some type of persona, right? So you could think about it as maybe it's your role or it's your department or it's your position. So some information that we know about you that we say, okay, if you are a member of this group, you get these access and you don't have to go and request these individual accesses. So that's kind of how I summarize it to kind of, help a leader understand what we're trying to accomplish here.
Ashley, do you agree with the way that does that make sense to you and how you approach it as well? Or do you have a different spin on it for your organization?
It does. We have a very similar spin. I like to think of just RBAC as just an overall methodology that has two major pieces. So one is defining the subset of users that need access and pulling them into the role. And then the second one is what access do they actually need to perform their job. It helps restrict access to what they actually need and eliminates the need for users to say, I'll have what Karen over here is having, where she may have been with the company for years and years and years. And it kind of locks down that access and stops kind of carryover access over time.
Yeah, I like to call that the similar access snowball. You start using model after, and the janitor who became CEO probably still has access to the janitor closet, maybe doesn't necessarily need it, right? Those sorts of things. Beth, I know with the kind of a compliance focus that you have at the bank, there's probably a pretty big focus on the role side of thing. How do you define it with your business stakeholders? And I guess does it align with what you're hearing here?
Absolutely. I define role-based access as a bundling of entitlements or access that grants users access to systems based on their similar attributes. So very similar to what everyone else has been saying. The attributes can be based on their region, their division, their department, or some type of HR component. It can be birthright, it can be requestable, but it's for consistent access for everybody.
Jim, from a consulting side of things, you're going to play the role of consulting expert here in the identity space. What do we typically see when we're talking to like our clients around? We want to get into roles and the definitions that we've heard here from Prince, Ashley, and Beth about. Does it make sense? Do you see alternatives that are out there when it comes to the definition of what a role is when it comes to identity?
Yeah, so there are alternatives. But first, I wanted to say that Prince, Beth, and Ashley, I think, nailed it in terms of, it's really an organizational unit. A role is for entitlements or access. As a consultant, I like to think of things in terms of a framework, a way to organize your thinking around a topic. So roles get talked about in terms of the authentication authorization side, as well as the identity administration and governance side. So there's the identity administration and governance side where you're creating the roles and you're provisioning the roles and could be going to multiple applications and turning into entitlements that the applications understand. And then on the authorization and authentication side where you're enforcing them. And why that's important is because when you talk to somebody about roles, you have to understand what perspective they're coming from. I think the other thing when I think about roles, especially on that IGA side of the house, is the organization around what are the different types of roles. I think there are mainly two. The first is kind of the birthright role, which is what do I get because of who I am? Or, I take my HR record and I'm from this office and in this department, et cetera, et cetera. And what access can you key off of that fact? I'm an employee, so I get the VPN and I get this and I get that. And then there are things where I can't do that. And those are maybe I'm on this project and my manager wants me to have access to this role. And we call those requestable roles. So you got birthright roles and requestable roles.
So that division of sort of like what you are and then what you can request after the fact. Beth, is that something that you guys have touched on as part of the deployment and how you've tackled roles? Or is that something that you're working towards? Where does that fit into maybe the strategy?
Oh, I think he's reading all my notes here because that's exactly where we're heading. We definitely want to, if we look at access as a big piece of pie, right? And what we want to do is take access for people birthright first. Anything that we can do on a common attribute or something that we can grant automatically, it's going to be one big piece. And so we're going to keep trying to narrow down what actually has to be requestable to very specific job-related duties. And so, yeah, we definitely are looking at requestable, and we're looking at the birthright to minimize what people have to actually ask for.
Prince, I think from a role perspective, if I'm not mistaken, you guys probably have a pretty big ERP platform, which is pretty notorious for having an obscene amount of roles in it. And I guess when we talk about here this concept of birthright versus requestable, how are you guys looking at sort of addressing that differential between access?
So we actually put it into 3 different buckets. So we talk about this notion of birthright, which is saying, hey, based off who I am, this is what I'm going to get. But when you talk about requestable access, you have something that is introduced to that mix, and that is that you don't want this, you want to be still compliant, right? And so there's this concept of if I request something, I might need to have a objective approver making sure that that access is appropriate. And then we talk about even with the birthright access, right? Making sure that it's in such a way that that objective approver also cautions out for a segregation of duty violations, right? So as a publicly traded company, that is something that we probably all have kind of seen and had exposure to. So just someone requesting something, typically your manager is just not enough to approve that. It has to have some type of objective approver and then an SOD process to make sure that, you know, the access that you're requesting in conjunction with the existing access you have would not compose a toxic combination for the organization.
Ashley, we kind of touched on the access snowball, and Prince just hit it again there. You know, from a role perspective, we're talking about this birthright versus, you know, add-on roles after the fact. I think you've been doing this probably for a little bit of a while, but where do things stand for your organization when it comes to how they've tackled sort of that question, right? What do I get when I walk in the door versus what happens to me day 2, day 3, day 100, whatever it may be?
Right. So I do agree that requestable is definitely a type of role that needs to be implemented. To Prince's point, to avoid the segregation of duties violation, I think there's a way that you can configure them to restrict the type of roles that people can see that they are able to request. So that way you kind of have that segregation of duties in place already. And then let's see, sorry, what was the other half of your question?
Just from the requestable standpoint, I think, you know, the differential between this is what I get when Ashley walks in the door. She's a new
Oh, yes. So I think that is always evolving and changing, and a great point to bring up, because as we evolve those birthright roles, we also need to communicate what access is provisioned automatically to the business to avoid them requesting those additional access. So that one is part of the maintenance process that needs to be defined, just who those stakeholders are and how they need to be communicated.
I want to come back to something that got mentioned a couple times here, and that's segregation of duties. I think that is probably a pain point that a lot of people struggle with. But I want to kind of build up the conversation. We started with kind of like, okay, what's the definition of roles? And I think we've got enough information here to kind of come up with a common standard around that, or at least an understanding. Maybe we don't agree, but it's the same. What I'd like to understand now is this is a difficult nut, as I said before, to crack and get started with. How did, you know, this project kick off, or this idea get started to say, hey, you know what? Prince went in and said, hey, we're going to do role-based access control. And then, you know, it just went full speed ahead. You know, Prince, from your perspective, how did you actually get started implementing roles for your organization?
Yeah, so typically, and I think this is probably going to be true for many companies, but typically when we undertake something like this, it's not for quite convenience yet at first. It's typically because of an audit finding, some type of write-up, a mandate. And so we all kind of corral around it and say, okay, this is how we want to address this finding and go and fix it that way. And then it evolves to kind of, okay, now that we see this, we see the benefits of this, how could we start to do this in a way that kind of as a tool to enable business?
So I know we like to dump on auditors a lot. They're the reason for all of our pains, but they can also be the reason for actually getting things done. There's nothing like a good old-fashioned audit finding to really kind of light the fire on a budget or a manager or a director or somebody to say, okay, we got to fix this thing. Yeah. Ashley, when you guys started down the role path, what was like the first couple of steps that you took to say, okay, we're going to do this thing. Here's how we did it.
Sure. So I actually started about a year after Lowe's began implementing RBAC, but I think the driving force for our side was more from an operational perspective to take some of the work off of our operations team and to automate it and take some of that pressure off of them to allow them to do other provisionings that they need to do. But how we really got started was we did some mining in a sample environment and just saw what the data produced. And then we went through and we would communicate with the stakeholders and say, does this align with what you're seeing? And then we played with the algorithms a little bit more until we could fine tune that process back.
How long of a process was it to mine that data and really kind of work with the business to establish, what might have been the initial baselines for a role?
Say initially about a year to a year and a half where those conversations were taking place, because we would get our feedback, take it back to the different applications teams to see if it lined up with what the business was saying, make sure we got all parties involved. And then additionally, it's a lot of data cleanup too, that you get a lot of access pulled into roles that, from the scenario I said earlier where Karen's been in the business for how many years, but so has 3 of our other coworkers. So a lot of the stale access gets pulled in. So it's a lot of fine tuning to determine what is actually consistent and needed for the here and now.
Yeah, definitely not an overnight task, right?
Oh, no.
Project. These things take forever. I think of data consistency, data quality, you got nested groups, people using groups for all kinds of things. Beth, I think I struck a chord with Beth just now. She had a little of an eye twitch when I said nested groups. Sounds to me like you got something you want to add in there.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, nested groups are a challenge for us here, that's for sure. Part of our process, too, is also breaking our entitlements down from a critical application perspective or high admin privilege versus what we consider kind of the lower level of distribution groups and maybe shared folders and things like that. So we kind of classified our data a little bit, and then we're initially rolling out the roles-based access on what I would consider to be less priority items as far as like distribution groups and kind of high level things that everybody has to have to get their job done. And we're holding aside the critical and administrative things to dole out very specifically at a more requestable level versus like a birthright level. So definitely looking and changing our approach a little bit from a priority perspective of high priority, high sensitive information versus less sensitive information.
Had there been instances where after you've gone through sort of that analysis, maybe something that was marked as critical really wasn't so critical? Lunch menu, something like that. I was like, I think that's right. Or maybe something that was maybe not marked as critical, probably should have had a higher, security or, approval process around it. Did you ever discover any of that kind of as your process went through?
Every day we have a new discovery. There's always that little pocket of something over there that wasn't labeled as admin, and when you drill into it, you go, oh wow, that was a big one. And I again, from the compliance area, I make sure that our entitlements are very well tagged from a criticality perspective. And if it's not read only, update, or admin, those are your big 3, and then we kind of go from there, and then with PCI relevance and things. But and then a big one is putting something out there that should be birthright to everybody, like internet access, And if you drop that out there, it's not really overly critical. People really do need to get to the internet.
Yeah, I've seen that in the last couple of years, especially with obviously COVID and working from home. There was a lot of scramble to get VPN in front of everybody. So I would imagine maybe there were some role adjustments made within the last couple of years to provide, network access, whatever it may be. Jim, if we think about it from sort of the level of what other companies in this industry are doing, or at least this space of identity, where do you typically see companies starting with roles? I think I'll kind of put my 2 cents in front, and maybe you can either tell me I'm crazy or whatever. I see roles typically as a little bit more of a mature step down a company's identity journey. Typically, we go into a company and we're kind of helping them out. We're still doing things by hand. It's manual. Faxes are coming in, right? Things are being printed out. And I think there's probably some level of baseline identity capability that needs to exist before it really makes sense to look at roles and start to do like the role analysis that Ashley was mentioning before. How do you see sort of that process working? Or do you think it's viable to start with, hey, let's start with roles and then work backwards from there?
I think we're all under pressure to deliver. So I think doing some of the baseline birth rate roles right off the bat makes sense. So if you're implementing an IGA system for the first time, for example, automatically provisioning somebody's IT capabilities, their SharePoint access, their VPN access. I think those are things you can do. I think it comes down to kind of one of the things I'm making myself notes as folks are talking, there's so much good content here, but it's like this 80-20 concept, right? Because I was thinking one of the questions, and I hope I'm not stealing from your questions here, but it's like, when are you done? Right. And it's like, you don't need a role for every single thing. Technically within your product, it might be called roles and you have to have a role for everything that gets assigned. But you don't need to have kind of that traditional business role or technical role for every single thing. I think you have to prioritize. So a couple things, in my opinion, the right way to go about this is first start by focusing on those IT roles that we talked about. Second is go department by department. So don't try and do a little bit with each department. Pick a department where you have an IT liaison or somebody who represents that department who really thinks roles is a good idea and is going to save their folks a lot of time, right? If you get that person who really thinks it's a good idea, they're going to put in the effort. So that's where I say to start, and start with, I think Ashley brought up the idea of like data mining. I ultimately feel like you have that data, you analyze that data, and then you engineer your roles from the top down so they make sense to human beings. I think if you let the AI do all the work, you get these roles that don't make any sense to people. And it's kind of like you have to be able to explain what the role does. Somebody has to actually conceptualize like, oh, if I give this person ERP clerk access, it lets them log in, gives them access to the dashboard, and lets them do these functions. It's not like all these nebulous things that could come with it. A couple other thoughts that I was having is, you need to have business ownership over roles. So even if they're IT roles, there should be an IT person who's assigned as the business owner of that role. What you don't want to have is like your SailPoint administrator be the owner of the role and who owns that role? Well, it's the IM person. No, it should be a business owner, whether that's an IT person or someone in finance or HR. And then the other point this is the last point, I swear, but it was, one of the things I was hearing over and over again was this idea of IM fatigue. Like when we set up our system and it's like constantly asking people for approval, approve this, approve that, they get blown away and they're just like, yeah, whatever. It's the same thing with like make sense and be the roles. So the lunch menu idea, like what about thinking about like if the lunch menu is low risk, why not auto approve and let that thing go through?
Yeah, you cut out there for a second. I think you're going for the fatigue part. We see that a lot with like MFA fatigue. And that's one of the common ways that people are getting breached is, you get spammed a whole bunch of times on your phones, like, and you just end up hitting approve just to make it go away. And the person got in. Sean asked a couple of questions, and I would certainly encourage folks who are out there, watching and listening, whatever it may be, to throw them to the QA. I'm going to hit the second one first that he sent in because I think this is a real important one. How do you tackle conversations with HR? Let's say, you're running like a Workday or an Oracle or an ADP or something like that, right? There's this authoritative source for identity, and continue to establish enough information to use membership criteria in a role without an issue of upstream without an issue of upstream issues, if I could say it just right. So what we're getting at here is you've got data coming from your authoritative source. How do you make sure that really all the business stakeholders are part of this from the HR side to make sure that when you're designing roles on the identity side, and maybe Prince will go with you first, how do you make sure that there's not that conflict, that business engagement with, other non-identity groups to make sure that those conflicts don't exist?
Yeah, it's a really if I could simplify the answer, I would say this phrase, do with me and not do to me. And when you bring people along, you kind of show the journey. You can kind of create this atmosphere of partnership and collaboration where when you're working on information in HR, right? You're bringing them along to say, hey, when we're going to key off of this information, or we'd like to key off of this information, right? How are your processes there? Are they robust? Are they accurate? Do you have process to catch when someone does not have a job title? Are you fixing that, right? Those type of things. So that way you don't have these unanticipated issues down the line. So you're bringing everybody along on the journey because, like someone said, everyone really has a unique part to play. The identity practitioner does not know most time what these roles are, what they give you access to do, et cetera. So I really think it's that collaborative process and iterative process over time and bringing people with you that kind of helps make sure that everyone is kind of playing on the same team.
I think, the butterfly effect is absolutely a phenomenon when it comes to changes in roles, right? Everyone really needs to understand that there are repercussions for changes in source data. Mm. So, if a role changes or a job title changes or a job code changes or whatever it may be, you really need your friends over on the, HR IT side or whoever's kind of managing the data within that system to be your friend. Chris is echoing, do with me, not to me. That's gold. That's obviously, honey is sweeter than a stick. You try not to have the stick, but, honey is probably the better way to go through it. I want to kind of tease out this other, kind of the underlying thread of engagement with the business that Shauna was getting to. Beth, when you were going through this process of kind of role design, how do you tackle that engagement with the business? Because Jim, I think, mentioned an important thing here, which is the business really should own the roles. It's their data. They should be responsible and understand what it is that they're approving, which sometimes can be a challenge.
Yeah, so we have two topics there, and I'm not sure which one to hit first, but one is from the end of line manager, approving for their own peaks and making sure that the roles that they're approving or what they're seeing, it has a good enough definition so they really can understand. We definitely get feedback on that all the time. And then on the role itself is having the owner actually go back and approve the content of that role and making sure that they truly do understand the elements that they are certifying that are inserted into that role. Just lots of communication out there with the business side. And we're getting lots of feedback. It's great when you get feedback because that means that they're reading or trying to be engaged with it. If they don't understand what it is that we're pushing out, we need to listen to that and figure out what we can do to make that more clear.
Yeah, Sean brings up a good point here where sometimes we've got, non-technical people who are responsible for technical things and they may not understand that. I think, that sort of internal consulting role that, each of us might play for our organizations. Ashley, when it comes to helping people understand maybe how their decisions might impact downstream IAM things, how do you typically engage with that? And do you have any tips for us?
Sure. So just going based on that constant communication, I think one of those things, speaking from an HR perspective, is just to see what type of notifications you can receive. Let them know, hey, if you're making a change, let us know. Like, it might be something that affects us, and maybe not, but always let us know. In regards to application teams and their changes, I always try to encourage them to talk to us first before they want to update a rule, because a lot of times they don't have the visibility to user perspectives that we do. So they can say, hey, I want to push this role to this user population. And I'll go back and I'll pull the population and say, is this what you want? And they go, oh, no, this is not what I want. And I'm like, well, that's what you said. Let's define it and tweak it. And you kind of determine that working partnership value through those conversations. They see what level they can bring to the table, and then what level your team can bring to the table as well.
Yeah, I think there's a yin and yang that comes to it when it's you're trying to help them, and sometimes you have to help them not be their own worst enemy.
Yes.
Sean wants to know how many of us have successfully rolled out roles in our business. So I'm actually going to open this up to everybody. If you can use the raise hand feature in the webinar, I'd love to see just kind of a count. If you've successfully rolled out roles within your business. I'm going to give people a couple minutes to kind of think about that, of whether they really think they were successful or not, because there's probably different degrees of, were we successful or what do we define as that? I'm going to start with Prince. When it comes to the role perspective, how successful do you think you've been to date in getting this put in place?
Yeah. So the way I measure success is I like to personally start with the small wins, right? Because those small wins allow me to keep going, and I say, oh, I see how that works. It starts to tell the story and go to that next phase. So for example, if we know that every employee is entitled to VPN access, and there's a process, a change management process now today that you request it and it goes to all these approvers, that's approval fatigue, et cetera. So to the business, they may say, you know what, wouldn't it be great if you were an employee and you just had that on day one? And I say, yeah, that would be great. And we could help you do it. So you start by addressing a problem that is a pain point for them, and then start to build into the security risk, et cetera. So that way you have some small wins and you can get some momentum, and it starts getting bigger and bigger. And that's how we've kind of rolled out our roles in the organization with things that, are very important to them. And then we start to say, okay, now that we've done that, what's the next model? What's the next iteration of this that we can continue to help strengthen our posture?
So I'm hearing sort of like the initial improv training of yes, and that's the answer. Like, okay, how are we going to do this? Yes, we can. And here's how we're going to do it, right? Yep. Put in the proper framework, rules, guardrails, whatever it may be. Beth, what do you think from a success standpoint? How successful do you think roles have been from a rollout perspective for your organization?
Yeah. So, what's the definition of done, right? I don't think we're ever going to be done. It's going to be a constant bridge painting, where you go back and new applications are introduced. But from a success standpoint, our community has embraced it. And that is fantastic. Everyone is impacted, from the end user through managers that have to approve. They're all impacted, whether they didn't get their access on day one that they needed to get their job done, or the managers, like you said, are just tired of approving and processing things through. So everyone has embraced the idea of, for us right now, birthright roles. What can we get done day one that nobody really has to look at, and that helps the employee have a great first day on the job? So success is, positive feedback that we're reducing the friction for people, and getting some good feedback from managers that their time is not spent in a wasted way.
Nobody wants to waste time. That is the one thing that bothers me every time, is sending a manager an approval for something that they're going to approve 100% of the time. Like, what is the point of that? That's checkbox compliance at its worst. I'm looking at the hands raised, and I think we're in the minority. We've only got really a couple hands that are raised that they think they've been successful. Yeah. So far, it sounds like, Prince, you've been successful. Beth, your organization's been successful with it. Ashley, what about your organization over at Lowe's? How successful do you think the rollout has been of role-based access control to date?
I think we've been very successful with the rollout of roles. I think, to everybody's point, roles is something that you can never mark as done. So that fatigue will always stay in place, because as users, there's the birthright access, and they're used to not approving that anymore. But then as your organization changes or your IT landscape changes, there's new things that need to be approved, and the users get fatigued that way. So there's always opportunity to improve your roles. But I think a big thing in our organization that we can show how successful we are is to actually take the time to do the analysis and the metrics to see, all right, we think our roles are successful, but how successful are they? So what percentage of the users actually receive a role? Is there a subset of the populations that's missing? Do they actually need a role? Do they not? And then also go at it from like a quantifiable view in terms of a dollar amount, just saying, here's what we have automated so far. How much does this actually save the money or save the company in terms of dollars?
So I saw a third hand raise up, definitely still in the minority of the 40 or so people we've got on the call today. It seems like there's a lot of work to be done when it comes to getting roles in place, which doesn't surprise me. I think roles are very difficult. And I'm going to put Jim on the spot here. Jim, of the hundreds of clients that we've worked with, what percentage would you say have successfully rolled out roles?
I mean, it depends on what you mean by success, right? Yeah. To that point, if success is when you've rolled it out and you're not doing it anymore, well, 0%, you're always going to be doing roles. But if you're talking about who have achieved value through the use of roles, that is success. Obviously, if you spend $1 million and you got very little value, that's not a success, right? But I think a very high percentage. Organizations that do some form of roles tend to get, outsized value, especially the early roles, because you tend to focus on the biggest bang for the buck. If I could, I took a note and I'm waiting patiently. So on the other question around HR data, so I feel like, from a consultant perspective, there's two formal ways to handle that. So the first is, how do you prevent getting blindsided by this at the very let's start with, how do you make sure that some change doesn't go into effect on your HR system that you weren't aware of and it crashes your system? So for me, that's done in change management. So change management should be, the HR system should be not changing values in their system without going through change management, so they're not like middle of the week just deciding to go from 3-digit location codes to 4-digit location codes. They should go through change management. Most companies do like 1 or 2 rounds of change management where there's release notes. You have to have a member of your IAM team on the change management board so you can catch that. What you really should do, though, is catch that early when the project is being defined. And so as part of your SDLC, you should have security architect or IAM architect who looks for things that would trigger, hey, this is going to affect us. Our feed from HR is going to break when we go from 3-digit codes to 4-digit codes if we don't make an adjustment, so that they can input to that project team that, hey, IAM needs to be involved.
Yeah, I think we were talking about there was like the IAM seat at the table, right? Their identity is threaded throughout an organization. And really anybody who's working on identity, whoever is leading that program, and it is a program, not a project, for an organization, they should be involved heavily with any of this stuff. There's a couple of questions that came in from Roshan and Christopher, basically dealing with kind of a similar issue, and that is data quality or missing data or changes in data from the authoritative source. And Jim, you kind of touched on it just now. I feel bad for Chris and his statement here is like, yeah, they went through an acquisition and it broke all their birthright RBAC roles because I'm guessing the authoritative source changed some data and the identity team either was involved and weren't given enough time to make updates, or most likely they probably weren't as involved with it and found out sort of after the fact. That's a tough one to come through. I mean, this is where communication is absolutely vital. People need to know just how integrated the identity program is with all of the systems. If it's done right, it is great, right? You reduce risk. Everyone's having an easier process to get onboarded, offboarded, compliance, risk, all that stuff. It's a great, easy button. But if it's not coordinated well and not communicated well, it is an absolute nightmare. So that is definitely an issue. And I think, there's another part of this where Roshan was talking about sort of missing identity attributes within an authoritative source and how people are handling that. I think there's an opportunity probably to have some sort of like augmented attribute lists. It could be within your IJ platform. It could be within maybe something like an Active Directory or an LDAP that is fed by an authoritative source. I'm curious, I'll start with you, Ashley, from a missing or broken attribute standpoint, is that something that you've had to deal with in the past? If it's something were to come up, how do you think you would address that today?
Sure. It's definitely something we've gone through in the past, but I think we try to catch it at the beginning as we onboard new applications. So we actually take the time to look at those attribute mappings and see what would be missing from the specific identities. So that's where we mainly capture it. So we don't push we don't onboard or fully onboard and say we're done until we get those attributes put into place. So that's probably how we combat it the most. And then for changes, again, it's just that constant communication, always have the seat at the table. If we always have somebody, say, from architecture for IAM at the table, then, if they hear about those potential attribute changes, the project's paused until we can all get into agreement on how that's going to affect all the downstream systems. To Roshan's point, I think sometimes, hopefully it'll never be a major disaster that happens, but sometimes it takes having one of those attribute changes for the business to see how involved and complex your IAM system is and all the downstream effects, so that going forward, everybody's almost in a nervous state to be like, we don't want to break anything. What do we need to do? And get everybody involved.
Prince, I would imagine with the complexity that comes into, the size of an organization like yours, and there's got to have been broken roles or things just not working the way they're supposed to. How do you tackle that sort of things? Maybe we can kind of crowdsource some information here that Chris can take back to help.
Yeah, and I think everyone has kind of hit it on the head. I would just add one other thing. So we talk about this concept of change management, right? But one idea is to have identity as an approver to certain changes, right? So if they are mature enough to go through a change management process, then at least now it's not just a passive, oh, we told you about it, right? You have to actually approve of that change. The other thing is having a near production type of test environment. So if you're making any material changes to the process, now you have these test plans where you run them through their paces and you should be seeing that end result. So if you change the role, et cetera, now we don't have that configured in our system, the end result is that person's not going to get that access. So it would have failed there where you could catch it. The other thing is, even if something is working well, there could be integrations, changes, et cetera. It's important to have KPIs. Those KPIs allow you to continuously monitor the effectiveness of your program, right? So that when something does materially change, you can pick it up and maybe try to work and mobilize to solve it on the onslaught instead of having this big, oh, what's happening here? You want to know it first. Be the first in line to know it and address it. So I think if you kind of incorporate some of those strategies there, it'll make it a little bit better. Obviously, you're not going to be able to compensate for every single scenario out there, but those are some big rocks that I think will help companies kind of manage that. The prevention of a bad day if something like that happens.
Yeah, you mentioned KPIs. It's almost like you're establishing sort of indicators of compromise to your identity platform, right? Something's not working the way that it should be, and the goal is to catch it before it becomes a problem. When you've got a massive switch with authoritative sources, that definitely screams change management and identity seat at the table all the way. Beth, I'm going to put you on the spot here because I'm going to put you in the same scenario as Chris. And maybe we can help him out. Your authoritative source has changed overnight and you were not involved. What is your Monday morning going to look like? And how are you going to start to plot a path to recovery here?
Yeah, no, definitely. One of those things is you hope you have some triggers in place, that would give you some alerts ahead of time. I mean, like Prince is saying, you try to make sure you know what's happening. One of our big triggers would be, one of my biggest fears is from our HR system, people that are active or not active, right? That's going to turn everybody on or off from a Birthright perspective. And we do have reports and things that are going out there monitoring for that flag. And we have a pause from the integration in between any noted change for the source and then coming into our environment. So if a couple of our big triggers get modified, we have a notification stream that's in place to let us know that prior to it being posted. Now, of course, it's a window, but if you don't catch it, you're kind of out. I think an immediate MERT would probably be called major incident response, and I'm sure I would be head at the table. And then, like you said, backtracking the changes that came in to see what might have caused it. That would be our approach. But proactive is definitely better than reactive.
It sounds to me like you've got like this identity bat signal that like shoots into the sky. It's like, oh my gosh, something just happened. We need somebody to come in and help us. Jim, I want to help Roshan out with the question he had, and it's really around that missing data from a authoritative source perspective. So let's say you've got a Workday or an ADP or something like that, and there isn't enough data in there to be able to drive downstream things that you want to have happen. And really, we're probably talking more about like attribute-based access control, which I do want to leave some time in. I know we're getting a little short on time here, so we're going to go to that next. But what are some methods that people might want to think about if there isn't enough data in your HR platform? Where else could I put data that might potentially drive some role-based decisions or attribute-based decisions for access?
Yeah, architecturally speaking, you have two options, I think. One would be to build error handling into your connector. The other is to build some kind of layer of abstraction. So it would be, like you said, maybe dump the data into a database or an LDAP or something like that to, kind of buffer the data quality. Those are from, that I think is the technical answer to it. There's something that I wanted to kind of I keep doing this, but backtrack to like an earlier conversation, because I was bringing up a lot of things like, okay, if you have this process, you've got IAM architect on the, each of the projects, and they're reviewing, and you might be sitting there thinking like, oh, wouldn't it be nice to have all those people? Like, but that's not reality, Jim. And I think it was Ashley made the statement of like, sometimes it takes a disaster. Well, sometimes it does, but this is where we as IAM practitioners, as leaders in the space, we've got to be telling our organization, look, IAM is middleware. IAM is like other areas of IT and needs to be treated with the same levels of discipline, like project management, like change management, like having a governance body. It's got to be treated very seriously, because if not, things can break down very quickly and we can have that disaster. We don't want it to come to that disaster, but it's very apparent when it does happen.
Yeah, you mentioned early on there sort of the alternative. And I was thinking, like a Meta virtual directory, which is what Craig, wrote in as well. Meta virtual directories and health checks that he calls circuit breakers. Right, these are all the technical controls that be put in place to sort of prevent a disaster, but they are still preventative as much as you can. Does not replace the people and the process in front of it. To be able to try to head off some of this, good communications, make friends with the key links with your identity program, HR, audit, IT. If there's representatives for the business. Mitch brought up an interesting point here, which is absolutely true, is that RBAC doesn't work for everybody. And this is kind of where I want to take the conversation next, because RBAC isn't the only way to do access control. There's also ABAC, attribute-based access control. There's PBAC, policy-based access control, which you could argue maybe are sort of the same thing. And in the case of life sciences, which is the example he's using, is they follow more of an entitlement-based access control, which is a single entitlement associated with a single role, which sounds like there might be a lot of roles and really gives them granularity to be able to take an attribute-based approach. And I'd like to understand, I'll start with you, Beth. What's next from a role perspective, right? We've been talking about RBAC, but there are perfectly valuable other methods like ABAC and PBAC that could be used. Are those things that you're currently exploring or looking at, or where do those types of things fall from your strategy when it comes to managing access?
Yeah, attribute-based is definitely, we have some birthright things which are based on people's attributes, the way that we're doing it, and layering, roles layering. We don't try to build everything into one role. We are actually trying to do a layering effect so that if someone moves from one job to the other, and different applications react differently. So if I had everything bundled into one role for your job and you move to another job, you might have to unenroll people from a current application that they will still use in the next job. And we don't want to have to re-enroll them and have them start over. So it depends on how different applications handle that unenrollment and re-enrollment. So we've taken a layering effect where it's an all associates, and then by region, and then by location, and then by department. So as people move through the company, we can pick and choose those layers and reapply their access. And that is definitely all based on their attributes.
Prince, when you think about the strategy of roles, I want you to put on your 2023 prediction hat here, since we're at the end of the year. How do you see roles evolving at Trane? Is it still going to be something RBAC? Have you started down maybe the path of ABAC or PBAC or some other methodologies for access control? Where do you think things are heading in the future?
Yeah, and I think, when I think about, because we just got through this strategy discussion where they say, what are we going to be doing? And one of the things I always say is, and it's an answer no one wants to hear. It depends, right? And that's because
we're the consultants. We're supposed to say that.
Yeah, it depends. And the reason that is, and I say it depends, is because it really depends on what you're trying to accomplish, what the company's tolerance and maturity is at that time, the care and feed, right? So if you are thinking of these big grand ideas and you don't have the right support apparatuses in place, it's not going to be functional, right? If you have all this role sprawl where you don't have the right people to go and update them, et cetera, understand what they are, you're going to run into audit issues. So I think finding the right approach to the right situation should be the strategy, and not try to boil the ocean and put one solution to fit all, because our business is not a one size fit all. We apply different models and different things to different strategies. And so that's why I just say it kind of depends. But I think the evolution would be taking advantage of these new tools that are giving us insights, et cetera, about how people are using our tools, where we have roles that people have, but they're not using, they're not logging into, clawing that back, making sure that we are using that kind of a defense in depth approach to kind of find the right pick for the right situation.
So I'm a big old Marvel nerd, so I'm going to pull out Hawkeye as my example, right? He's got the bow and arrow, and he's got a quiver with a whole bunch of different arrows that do all kinds of weird stuff. Maybe Batman's the same analogy, right? He's got the bat R back and the bat A back and whatever it may be. You do not have to follow one methodology, right? It's not like you're subscribing to, this is how we're going to be doing it, and everyone must conform to this. This is not the Borg, right? We're not going to assimilate in this scenario. What we want to do is try to come up with the right approach. And it may be very similar to like what Mitch has done with his organization, it sounds like, where they've gone down this entitlement route, and it's very granular, but if it works, it works, right? You don't necessarily need to get super crazy with it. So I think that's something to kind of think about. Ashley, let's put on your prognosticator hat here. How do you feel about some of the other alternatives when it comes to RBAC versus ABAC, PBAC, and any other backs that might be out there?
I think everybody said it well. I think the other alternatives are great, but it really depends on, the situation at your organization. So at least how I approach, the future of RBAC and ABAC and PBAC and where we should use it when is actually listen to the strategies of the organization as a whole and what they're focused on, and try to get your head in the game on where, they're headed from an IAM or a roles perspective. And then you take that use case and you see, does it fit in our traditional RBAC model? Do we need to mold and shape it into an ABAC model? What does that actually look like? And so we're not just trying to come up with something out of thin air. We're actually using it for the specific use case of the company that they need at that point in time.
Jim, you and I spent an awful lot of time talking with, vendors in this space, other companies, et cetera. What's the future of RBAC in a quick soundbite? Because I want to get to our closing out here.
Yeah, my prognostication is RBAC will be just as good a conversation next December as it is right now. ABAC and PBAC are basically the same thing. They're the use that they get applied at the time of authentication authorization. So I've got these attributes about me when I go to access the application, rather than it looking in the database of roles, it just says you have these attributes, I'm going to give you this access.
The much more data-driven approach, which I think is ideally where a lot of organizations like to be. Do they have the data to make it successful? That is always the tricky question, right? I think there's varying levels of success that you can probably get to. All right, I know we're coming up on time here. And one of the things that we like to do on our podcasts, identityattthecenter.com, is to really end on a lighter note. And so we were kind of thinking about this, what are the questions we want to do? This is something that's not identity related, just to kind of have fun towards the end. And I'm going to pass it around the room real quick. Prince, what is the best or worst meal you have ever had?
It just happened recently. I bought an Instapot and I put chicken in there, and it tastes like boiled. I don't know what it was, but I think for the chicken, that should be in the air fryer, not the Instapot.
Instapot chicken is amazing. So welcome to the club. Ashley, what about yourself? What's the best or worst meal you've ever had?
Sure. And I think mine comes just from a shock. So mine was actually when I took a trip to Germany. I, just landed, just wanted a drink, was like, I'm tired. Let's get a drink. Let's relax. And so I had somebody order for me. And then I come back and I taste it. I'm like, that's not a beer. What is that? And it was banana flavored beer. If you can imagine, it exists. And so, on first reaction was like, oh, this is the worst thing I've ever tasted. And then you get into it, you're like, actually, this is pretty good, but it's very funky. Like, it's not what you expected.
Banana is one of those flavors that you need to be expecting. Otherwise, it's like, whoa, what just hit me?
Exactly.
Beth, what's the best meal or worst meal you've ever had?
Yeah, the worst meal I've ever had was the one that I made, so I can blame nobody but myself. And I have learned the hard way that you do not ever put broccoli in a crock pot. Just, it's a hard no. Don't ever do it. Don't ever do it to anybody that you love in your family. If you have that relative that you may want to do something fun for, yeah, go ahead and do that. But that was the worst.
Sounds to me like that might be the most valuable piece of information that's come out of this entire hour is don't put broccoli in a crock pot.
Don't do it.
Jim, best or worst meal you've had?
Might steal your answer, Jeff. That steak that we had in Vegas, that Wagyu steak, it's like over $100 for a piece of meat with no sides. Saying this is the biggest ripoff until I ate it.
Is there anything better than a really nice dinner that you're not paying for? I mean, that's pretty good.
It's the kind of dinner you have to mortgage your house for.
Yeah, no kidding. Speaking of mortgaging a house, I think my best meal was French Laundry. It was sort of a bucket list item for us, and my wife and I were finally able to take her parents there. So that was pretty good. My worst as a bonus was pizza that I had in Paris, which was completely awful. Would not recommend. All right, we got 2 minutes. I got one more bonus question, and I want to see, from the folks who have stuck with us at the end, I want to take a quick poll. How many people think Die Hard is a Christmas movie? Raise your hand if you think Die Hard is a Christmas movie. I see Beth's got her hand up. We're seeing okay, yes. Now we're seeing hands all up over the board over here. This might solve maybe some of the conversations you might be having with your family around this time of year. What's the Christmas movie you're going to watch? You can throw Die Hard out there because it absolutely, in my mind, is a Christmas movie. So, with that, we're going to head and kind of close things out. I'll pass over here to Tom. Thank you again for inviting us. And thank you to Beth, Prince, and Ashley for joining us.
You've been listening to Identity at the Center. We hope you've enjoyed the show. Make sure to like, rate, and review. And we'll be back soon. But in the meantime, hit the website at identityatthecenter.com and find us on Twitter at IDAC Podcast. See you next time on Identity at the Center.